Hello everybody, and welcome to my GameMaker tutorial series. In this series I'm going to show you how to program your very own card game in GameMaker Studio. Now for my example throughout this series I'll be using the card game Pokemon the Trading Card Game. By the end of this video you'll be able to create your room for your game, represent your deck, and represent your hand. And in the next videos, I'll show you more advanced tips and tricks when programming in GameMaker Studio. So let's begin. I'm going to open up GameMaker Studio, create a new project in the GameMaker language. Then it will ask you to save your project somewhere. So I'll save it here and I'll call it Card Game. And then we have a blank canvas. So in any card game, you need to represent your objects, your instances with sprites. So the first thing I want to do is import my first sprite. So you can do that by right-clicking the Sprite tab on your resource bar. You can name it. I will name mine SPR Field. I choose SPR underscore in the beginning so that I can differentiate it from other things in my resources. So when you create your own game, you're going to have a lot of different resources, a lot of different sprites, objects, scripts, paths. So you want to be able to differentiate them quickly. And the best way to do that is to add a little text before that says this is a sprite, this is an object, this is a script. So that's why I put SPR underscore. So since I named it SPR Field, you'll see that this will change once I click out of it. Now, you can create your own sprite, which a lot of people do. I'm not that talented, so I'm going to import an image I found online. So this is the field I would like to use. You can see that it has a place for your bench, if you've ever played Pokemon, your prize cards, your deck, your trash, and the card you're battling with. Now, I'm a little old school, I guess. I like the deck to be on the bottom, so I'm going to use the bottom for my deck and the top for my trash. So, very important when creating a sprite is to define its origin when you create the sprite. If you don't, and you have to come back to it, it can be a pain. For my project, for my card game that I created, I always used the middle center as my origin. So you can see it updated over here. Now, it is very important to lock the origin once you define it, because if you're going around and you accidentally click it and move away, it will change the origin, which will be very bothersome when you start to use it and it's not printing out the way you planned it to be and you don't know why. So, first thing you do after you define your origin, lock it so that you can click all around it and you're not going to mess it up. So if you notice in this field there is no place for your hand. So I would like to be able to show my hand when I'm playing without it being over my bench or over anything important. So before we get into that, let's go into our room. Now, my room's default size is 1024 by 768. 1024 width, height is 768. Now, I want to use the background or the sprite I just uploaded as my background. In order to do that, I go to my Layers tab. You'll see Instances. This is where you'll put your objects, and Background. As you can see down here, when I click that, now I have a Background Property tab, and it has no sprite. And the color is black. Now you see this room is black, but it's not really black. It's a weird ether that you shouldn't use. You should define it as something that isn't this, because if you print on it and you try to move away, it will look funny once you start moving objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a sprite. I'm going to create the background to be the field. But you can see that the field is a lot smaller than the room. So I want to tailor the room to be the size of the field. Now, I know if I go to my sprite, the width is 640 and the height is 587. So that's how big I want my room to be for now. So I'm going to go to my Properties tab And at width, I'm going to use the width of my sprite, which was 640, and the height, which was 587. And as you see, it now fits it perfectly. Now, if I want to preview my game, I can just hit this play button. It will compile the game and give you a little preview right here. So, this is what the game looks like. I like it, but like I said before, I have no place to view my hand. So I want to give adequate size before I start doing anything so that I don't have to reformat my game in any way when it comes to adding objects and printing them somewhere. So I'm going to do that now. But first I need to know how big I need, or how much room I need for my hand, or for a card. So before I resize this room, I'm going to create a way to, or I'm going to create a tool that I use to troubleshoot and help me program that I think you will find very helpful. So in order to do that, I need to create an object. An object is something you put in your game to do something. It could be an enemy, it can be a player, it can be a card, it could be a deck, it could be a discard pile, it could be your opponent, it could be a client, it could be a server, it could be anything. But for this tutorial, it's going to be a deck. So objects have an assortment of events. Each event does something differently. For this tutorial, I'm going to focus on the create event, the step event, and the draw event. Now first, the draw event, what this does is it just draws to your room. And that's what I want. I want to draw my mouse coordinates to the room. In order to do that, I need to add some code. Now I'll be using some GameMaker functions to help me do this. So I can draw text to my room by using the draw text function. When you use GameMaker functions and you click within the parentheses, it shows you at the bottom of the object what values it needs to use the function. So here it needs an X coordinate, or it needs an X position, a Y position, and a string. So I'm drawing a text, it needs a string. So what I'm going to give it is 100 for the X coordinate, 200 for the Y coordinate, and I'm going to use another function called string, which turns anything within the parentheses to a string. So I'm going to do mouse X, which is a built-in GameMaker variable, which is very useful. So far, this line will draw my mouse coordinate to the room. But I also want my Y coordinate. So I'm going to create a little space and do the same for my mouse Y. So now I'll have my mouse X coordinate and my mouse Y coordinate drawn to the room at coordinates 100 and 200. Now what I want to do before that is set my text color, or set my draw color, to something I can read, and that is going to be black. So you'll see that I use C black, and you probably don't know what that is. GameMaker has some colors you can use, and if you middle click anything built into GameMaker, it will open up a help tab that better explains it. So here are all the colors I could use. I primarily use black and white because they're the easiest, and it also tells you kind of a summary of what it does. So say if I were to do that to the draw set color, it'll tell me the description of the function, it'll tell me what the function needs to work, and it'll give me a little example if I needed help. So if I hit the play button, you'll see that the coordinates won't be printed to my game. And that's because this object is not in the game yet. So in order to do that, there are two main ways to do this. You can just drag it into the room itself by clicking Instances under the Layers tab. or within your creation code, you can put a built-in function that will put it in your game for you. But I'll show you that later. So now that it is in the room, if I hit the play button, you'll see that it will print my mouse coordinates so that I can see them. So you can see right here, wherever I put my mouse, it spits out these coordinates. Now, I did this for a lot of reasons. I need the coordinate of where to put my deck, where to put my benched cards, my prize cards, and this will tell me. But most importantly, I need to know the size of the card so that I can create some space in order to have room for my hand. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take this coordinate at the top corner, 550 by 451, and the coordinate at the bottom, 626 by 556, and do some math, and I come up with 76 for the width and 106 for the height. So that means I need an extra 106 pixels at the bottom so I could fit my card. But of course I want a little bit more room, so I'm just going to do 110. And then I want it also at the top for my opponent's hand. So I'm going to add a total of 220 pixels to my room size. So in order to do that, I choose background. I go to my room settings, and in my height, I'm going to add 220, which comes out to 807. So now you see I have a little bit more room here with this black that I don't want. So what I want to do is create another background layer, and I want it coincidentally to be white. So, and I want it to be behind the field. So I will drag my background above the new layer I just created. But this is giving me a lot of space on my side. I would like it to be on the other side too, so that me and my opponent have the same amount of distance. So what I need to do that is offset it by half of the distance I added, which is 110. So now it's perfectly in the middle. Now you'll see that when I display this, that the coordinates aren't going to be in the same position that they were. That's because the size of the room changed. So now we have our room created and we know the size of our card. It's going to be a width of 76 pixels and a height of 106 pixels. So now let's import some sprites to represent our cards. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to my workplace. I'm going to go to the Sprites tab, create a new sprite, and when I represent a card in my game, I use two sprites, the card back and the card front. So I'm going to call this sprite SPR_card back, and I'm going to import the back side of my image. Again, I want to use the middle center and lock it immediately, but you can see that the width is 179 and the height is 250. That's bigger than what we want our card to be. So I want to show you what that looks like in the room. So I can add a sprite to my object if I would like. This object won't have a sprite, but for the sake of this example, I'm going to give it a sprite so you can see just how big it is. So if I were to print this out, this is how big the card would be on this room. This is how big the card would be in this room. As you can see, it's not going to fit anywhere and it takes up too much space. But luckily, using those coordinates, we know exactly how big it should be. So I'm going to remove this sprite, and I'm going to change this by clicking this Resize Sprite button. Under the Maintain Aspect Ratio section, I'm going to change the size to what I want it to be. 76 pixels wide, and it changes it to 106. It changes the height automatically to 106 because we're going to maintain that aspect ratio. I'm going to click Apply. So you can see my card got very tiny. So let's go back into the room and see what it looks like now. So now you can see that it can fit perfectly in these slots. let me turn the grid off so I can drag it wherever I want, and it covers that almost perfectly. We'll make it cover it perfectly when we print it into the field. So now let's remove the sprite because we don't want this to have one, and import sprites of other cards. So this one will be Squirtle because he's number 1. I'm going to upload that image, give it its origin, lock it, and then change the size of it. Now, I find it's always easier and quicker to do one job at a time. So I'm going to add all my sprites now so I don't have to do it later. Next is Charmander. Middle center, lock, change the size. And then the last sprite I'm going to use for this video, Bulbasaur. Okay, so now we have all of our sprites created. We don't need these windows open. They take up a lot of space. And in order to maneuver quickly, we want to take everything that we don't need off. So now we're back at our object, our deck object. And the next thing we need to do is create our variables. This is very important. In programming, you need a lot of variables to do a lot of things. This is important to have all your variables in one spot. So that's one thing I like about GameMaker is you have your own section for your variables so you don't lose them. What I've learned about GameMaker is in programming languages I've used, it's all linear. It works from top to bottom, left to right. In GameMaker, it's not that way. It's multilinear, except this create event. So when this object is created, it's going to go through this create event, and it's going to create every variable you declare in this section before drawing anything or doing any of its logic, which is why GameMaker separated the create event from everything else. Because if it was not in its own section, the game wouldn't be able to function because everything is moving at the same time all the time. So the variables you want to create are your deck position, your card width, your card height, your deck count, your hand count, all of these things. Now, when you create a game, it's hard to determine where you want these things to be. And it's hard to keep track of them, which is why you want to create it in a variable. So I want to choose where I want my deck to be. So I'm going to open up my game and use the tool I created to figure out that coordinate. So I want my deck to be here, and I'm going to use the coordinates 586 and 612. So I don't have to forget it or keep typing it in multiple places. I'm going to say deck X is equal to 589, and deck Y is equal to 612. Now, it's very important to comment your work, especially if you're new, so that you can easily understand what you were doing at the time, because once you get deep into your program, you're going to forget the things you did. So I'm going to type deck X coordinate, these are comments, and deck Y coordinate. Now, I already know that my card width is 76. And my card height is 106. Now, since this object is for my deck, I want to initialize my deck. So, in Pokemon, you can have, I believe, 60 cards. So I'm going to create my deck count to be 0 because there's currently no cards in my deck. My pointer to be 0 because I want it to be pointing at the very first position, which is 0. And then I'm going to initialize space for my deck. So 60 cards. So this is a for loop that will run through this instance within these curly brackets as many times as I want, between 0 and 60. So I'm going to create an array for my deck, and I'm going to initialize it to be 0. So there is a deck variable, deck I, set to 0. So this is very important because if you create a deck with 55 cards and you use a function to go through your deck, and a deck can be 60 cards, and you want to see the 56th or 58th card in that deck and it's not there, it's going to say there's a problem, this variable isn't initialized to anything. So I want to initialize it to something so I don't run into that problem. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build my deck. Now, what I do to represent my cards is I don't represent them by names or images, I represent them by numbers. So what I'm going to say is the first position of my deck is going to be 1, card 1, whatever card I choose for that to be. And then the second position of my deck is going to be card 2. And then the third position of my deck is going to be card 3. I have 3 cards: Squirtle, Charmander, and Bulbasaur. Now I've created a deck of 3 cards. Oh, and I messed up a little. This should be 0, 1, and 2. Now, I need to change the count of my deck because now I have 3 cards in my deck, so I'm going to change the deck count variable to be 3 so that the program knows that this array or your deck has 3 cards in it. Now, the best way for me to do this without having to worry about numbers 0, 1, 2, how many cards are in the deck, is I do this. I++. I'm going to set I to be 0. And I'm going to increment it every time I add a card. So by the time I'm done, my deck count will be equivalent to what I is. So if I do this, and I triple my deck, I don't have to change my deck count code because I's incremented throughout. So now I have a deck of 9 with each card represented 3 times. Now, what is this? All this is an array of numbers. Now, how can I visualize this array, or how can I visualize these cards if they're only numbers? So the way I do that is I create a sprite array. So I've created the sprites. I have these cards as numbers, but now I want to create an array of sprites. So the way I do that is very similar to the way I created my deck because they're the same. They're both arrays, except I'm using this array for my deck and this array to hold all of my sprites. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set I equal to 0 again so that I can restart this array counter. And I'm going to call my sprite array sprite array. I++, and I'm going to equal that to the card back sprite. So now the first sprite of my sprite array is the card back sprite. Now I'm doing this purposefully because I don't really need the card sprite back. I can always refer to it another way, but I want it to take this 0 spot of my sprite array because if you look at my card numbers, they start at 1. and I want my card numbers to match the sprite array numbering. So if I were to put my card number in that sprite array, it will give me the sprite of the card I want to use. Might sound a little confusing, but it's theory. So what I want to do is put this theory into practice. So I'm going to create 3 more sprite array values. I'm going to do Squirtle, Charmander, and Bulbasaur. It is very important to remember what your card number is, its position in your sprite array, and other things, because when we get further down the line in this tutorial series, we're going to use a lot of these arrays to call things of cards. I want to know its name. I want to know its HP. I want to know its skills. I'm going to do the same thing for those, but in different arrays. So what I'm going to do now is I only have 3 cards defined in my game. And I want that to be globally known everywhere. So that if I'm trying to get a card sprite for a card number that's too large, I need my program to know that so it doesn't try to pull something that's not there. So I'm going to create this global variable that won't change. You can create, so I guess it's not a variable. I'm going to create this value that will never change. And that's going to be known globally. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a macro. A macro is just a value that's defined and won't change. So my macro I'm going to call card max. I'm going to set it to I, so that the macro should be, that number will be however many cards are in that sprite array. So I'm going to set I equal to 0 so that I could use it again down the line. So let me show you what I've done. So since we have the deck coordinates and we have the sprites, we're going to print them to the field. So in order to do that, I want to print all the cards in my deck. So I'm going to use another for loop. So I'm going to say for I is equal to 0 and I is less than deck count I plus plus. So this will go from the first position of my deck to the last defined position of my deck. If that deck value is greater than 0, because we defined all of them to have a value, but they don't have a card number. I want to draw the sprite of that card. So I'm going to use this function drawSprite. Now what this does is pretty much just draws a sprite. It takes the sprite image that you choose. I could choose sprite card back. I need to use its sub-image, or whatever image I want to use. A sub-image is any image that is in that sprite that sprite may have. Because you could use an animated sprite where it's just an image, it's multiple images played in a loop to look like an action. We don't have that, so all of our images will have a -1 sub-image for the first image of that sprite. I'm going to do it at my deck X coordinate and my deck Y coordinate. So these, if you look at the bottom, are all of the variables it needs to utilize this function. So since I'm using my sprite card back, it's just going to draw my deck for as big as it is. So if I hit this play button, you'll see that my deck is at the position where I want my deck to be. Now you see I have 9 cards in my deck, but it looks like there's only 1 card on the field. So I want it to look more like a deck. So in order to do that, I want to create a little buffer in between my X position and my Y position, depending on its position in the deck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 0.4 for every card that's currently in the deck to my X position, and I'm going to add it because I want it to go towards the right of the screen. And for my Y position, I'm going to do the same, except I'm going to subtract it. 0.4 times I. And I'm subtracting because I want it to go upwards. So what this will do will create a little buffer and make it look like cards are actually being stacked. So let's hit the play button and see if we can notice it. If not, I'll add more cards so you can see it kind of pile up. So as you can see, it looks thicker, it looks more like a card deck. I like it. So, but what if we wanted to print the sprites of the card? So what I'm going to do is, instead of using the sprite card back, or the card back sprite, I'm going to use the sprite array we created already. And since the card numbers match the sprite array numbers, I can just put in deck I, and it will go to that sprite array, find the matching sprite, and print that instead. So let's see what that looks like. We have Bulbasaur on the top of the deck, but how do I know all the other cards are in there? I know we have, what, 3 Bulbasaurs, 3 Squirtles, 3 Charmanders. So I want to space this out a little different so I can see all the cards, so I know it's actually the deck I created. So in my X position, I'm going to subtract this because now I want it to go the other way, because if it goes more right, I won't be able to see it. So I'm going to keep that buffer there, but I'm also going to subtract the card width so that the cards should be laying next to each other instead of on top of each other. So let's see what that looks like. See what it did there? That was my mistake, because the distance needs to be a function of I. So I'm going to put these in parentheses and multiply it by I so that it looks how I want it to look. Oh, why are they doing this to me? Oh. In order to be very good at programming, you have to be very good at math. I like to think that I'm very good at math, but since I subtracted, it was as if I added it because they're in parentheses. So I needed to add that 0.4 with the card width to get the distance I want. So now that it's correct, we can see the deck laid out. So we see we put Squirtle, Charmander, Bulbasaur, then we copy and paste that 3 times. So Squirtle, Charmander, Bulbasaur, Squirtle, Charmander, Bulbasaur. So we know the deck is actually created and it's stacked like a deck, and it's being drawn on the field. So now I want to create my hand. So I need to do the same thing I did for my hand that I did for my deck. So let's change this back to what it was. And let's create a hand object. OBJ, hand. First thing you always want to do is initialize your variables. So I want to reinitialize my card width, my card height, and I want to create a hand counter. I had a deck counter, now I need a hand counter. I have 0 cards in my hand because I haven't created my hand yet. And then I want to allocate memory for my hand for the same reason I did for my deck. Now, we're going to create a hand size of 8. So I'll do for I 0 all the way up to I is less than 8, which would be 8 total times. I'm going to create a hand position that has a 0 value. So that hand value will be the card number that I want. Since I don't want a card to be in the hand yet, I'm going to make it 0. So now I want to create a hand. So I'm going to set I equals to 0. Hand I equals some value. And let's just put 3 cards in my hand. Let's put Squirtle, Charmander, Squirtle. And now I want my hand count to match that. As you see, I missed something, which would have made that not work. I'm going to set I equals to 0 in case I want to use it later. So now I have my hand memory and cards in my hand. But again, I need to represent that in a way so the player can see it. So I'm going to create an add event. I'm going to add an event that is a draw event. So what I need to do now is figure out where I want to draw my hand. So I can use this tool again. There's my deck. And this is where I want my hand to be. So I can choose any place on here. So I'm going to use coordinates 180 and 150. 180 and 150 to begin drawing my hand. It's good to use these tools. So what I'm going to do is for I equals to 0, and I is less than the number of cards I have in my hand. If my hand card is bigger than 0, which means there is a card there, I want to draw the card sprite at hand I, and I want the subimage to be -1 at 180 by 750. So this will draw all cards in my hand, but since I created no buffer, it's going to draw all the cards on top of each other. So what I need to do now, see, the hand isn't there because I didn't put it in the room. So what I need to do is go back, put my hand in the room, and then press the play button. And it's giving me this error saying sprite array is not an array. That's because I need to initialize my array in every object if it's not a global variable. And if you define something in one object, it's not defined in another object. So what I typically do is I could copy and paste this, and I could copy and paste this from here to here, from here to here, and hit the play button, and it will work. But if you do that, you're going to create a lot of unnecessary code. So it's important to create these things called scripts. scripts is pretty much a function. If you know anything about programming, it's a function. It's a line of code you can call over and over again so that you don't have to use the amount of lines that it takes to write that code. So I'm going to caveat to showing you what a script is. So since I know my card max is 3, I'm going to keep this here, but I'm going to erase this. And I'm going to erase this. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to create this script called initialize sprite array. Now this is a function I'm going to create. As you can see, it didn't color like a defined function would in GameMaker. That's because this doesn't exist. So I need to create this. So I'm going to go to my scripts tab, right click, create script. I'm going to name it the same thing I named in the object, init sprite array, and I'm going to paste it. But I isn't here, so I'm going to create a local variable. Whenever you do scripts, it's very important to use local variables in here. Now there are times where you won't, but we'll get into that later. Because if you were to use this, you're changing the variable in the object that you're calling this script in. So if you don't want that, use local variables, which is accomplished by using var before the variable. This I here is different than the I in that object. So I created the array for this object by calling this script. As you can see, it changed the colors now, and since I want it to be in the other object, I can just paste that. So now I don't have to use as many lines as I did before. So if I hit this play button, let's see if it worked. Boom. So my sprites are still appearing, so I did it correctly. Now back to my hand. All my cards are stacked on top of each other and I can't see them. I want to see all my cards, so I need to create a buffer to my draw event. So I want them to span out. So I'm going to alter my card event depending on how many cards are in my hand. So I'm going to add a buffer that's, let's say I want to add a 0.5 or a 5 pixel space in between each one of my cards. And I also want to add the length of the card as well. Now, if I do this without multiplying it by I, it's just going to move the card, the pile of cards over. But if I multiply it by I, and I is always different, it's going to create a line of cards. So let's hit the play button and see what my hand looks like. So I have 3 cards in my hand, and I have my deck over there. So this is where I would like to end this tutorial. I know it was a lot of information, but in the next video, I'll expand onto this so that it can feel more like a card game. So if you have a deck here and you want to draw a card and you just want to click on it to draw instead of having to initialize it in the create event, you can have a variable hand that's dependent on your actions within the game. Now, the other thing I'll show in the next video is how to shuffle your deck, because of course that's very important. Anytime you pick a card from your deck or when you initialize it, you want it to be shuffled up. I won't be able to show you how I'm doing this with the deck right now. I'll show you that in a later video, because in order to do this, it takes a lot of math and programming that's on a higher level than the beginning of this tutorial. So if you found this interesting, please let me know. Hit the like button, subscribe for more. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. If you want me to slow down or speed up a little bit or go into more advanced topics because you may know how to do this already, let me know. I'll tailor this series to the viewers. So thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something today.